Good evening. My name is John Gutierrez. I'm director of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for this conversation on a very important issue, which is the border crisis. This is the second event that we have done in partnership with the Office of Public Programs here at the Graduate Center. And I want to thank Karen Sander and her team for making this event happen both in person and online. Tonight's event brings together a panel of experts to help us understand and grapple with the most current iteration of the immigration crisis that has bedeviled our country for many, many decades. There are no easy answers to this issue, but the women and men gathered here this evening can certainly help us think through some possible solutions. It's my job to introduce the panelists tonight, and I'm very happy to do so. Let me start with Cinthya Santos-Briones, who is a visual artist, educator, and cultural organizer with indigenous Nahua roots based in New York. A former researcher at the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico. Her work focused, among other things, on indigenous migration. As an artist, her work focuses on a multidisciplinary social practice that combines participatory art and the construction of collective narratives. She currently serves on the faculty of the Newmark School of Journalism here at CUNY, and her work appears or will appear in the screen behind our panelists. Secondly, Julia Preston is an American journalist and contributing writer for the Marshall Project, focusing on immigration. She was a foreign and national correspondent and an editor at the New York Times for 21 years, a member of the New York Times team that won a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting in 1998, focusing on corruption in Mexico. She is the co-author with Samuel Dillon of Opening Mexico, The Making of a Democracy. Elizabeth Cohen is the Maxwell Professor of United States Citizenship in the Department of Political Science at Boston University and Associate Editor of the American Journal of Political Science. Her most recent book, Illegal: How America's Lawless Immigration Regime Threatens Us All, was published by Basic Books in 2020 and traces the impact of nativist and anti-immigrant politics in driving U.S. immigration policy. Tran is Associate Professor of Sociology and International Migration Studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. As an immigration scholar and urban sociologist, his research and teaching look at New York City and its diverse neighborhoods as a social laboratory for innovative research that seeks to inform urban social policy. Finally, we're honored to have Fernanda Santos as our moderator this evening, an accomplished journalist. Fernanda was a staff writer and national bureau chief for the New York Times and has focused her career on elevating the stories of underrepresented and misrepresented communities. She is currently professor of practice at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication and a contributing columnist for the Washington Post. She is also, and I think this is less well known, a co-writer of Americano, a musical based on the life of an Arizona dreamer that ran off Broadway in the spring of 2022. Please join me in welcoming our panelists for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for the introductions. Good evening, everybody who is here and also watching in Zoom. It's really a great honor for me to moderate this conversation about what I believe is one of the most consequential issues of our time. We have an unprecedented number of migrants who are on the U.S. Mexico border, and we also have an unprecedented number of migrants just outside of our door, right here in our city, in New York City. Border agents have logged, according to the latest numbers, 2.5 million encounters with migrants along the U.S. Mexico border, and more than 140,000 migrants have arrived in New York City over the past 20 months, and they keep on arriving every day. In Congress, legislation to send aid to Ukraine and Israel today collapsed in the Senate because Democrats refused to sign on to a bill that tied the aid to strict border enforcement measures. Our immigration system is in shambles. So is our asylum system, and it has not evolved to adapt to the realities of today throughout the world. And the U.S. is not the only country struggling with it, and we have incredible people who are super knowledgeable about it to talk to us about it. And so I wanted to kick off the conversation, Elizabeth, by asking you a question, because I think that a lot of times we forget that what's going on today is very much connected to what has been going on for quite some time. There's a history behind it, and I wanted to focus on the issue of citizenship. We operate under this increasingly very narrow and rigid definition of citizenship in this country, and also what it means to be an American, what the meaning of the word patriotism has been hijacked, right? How much do these definitions, the traditional ones and the transformed ones by politics, play a role in the intractability of immigration politics today? And how can we deal with the politics of immigration while also dealing with the question of who belongs here in the United States?
Thank you so much. I want to thank our organizers and everybody who is willing to engage on this really difficult question that we're dealing with. And I know that there are other people here who are going to speak specifically to conditions at and beyond the border, as well as the deadlock on Capitol Hill. This is a really big picture question, and I think it's really behind a lot of what we see that ends up making actual headlines. And I was reflecting on the topic before we got started, and one thought kept occurring to me, I guess in terms I haven't really thought of before, and that is that it's become quite standard to treat citizenship as subject to the same kind of scarcity that we treat lots of material goods that we need or want. And that's probably not a very appropriate way to think about citizenship, because it is not a scarce good, right? There's no boundary on the supply of citizenship. It's a legal status that offers people political standing, rights of free movement, and in the United States, very, very minimal social rights. But to people who've absorbed what are now increasingly common views about white replacement, to use a phrase we're hearing a lot, citizenship does seem like something that needs to be made scarce. And so denying people pathways that they could otherwise take to become citizens is framed as a way to advance nativist goals, protect real Americans who would otherwise be replaced by non-Americans. It's also not true, right? There's been no time in United States history when people who considered themselves to be white thrived in the absence of people they considered non-white. No time. But much of what's going on at the border and now in the large swath of space beyond the border, where we outsource a lot of immigration and asylum functions and enforcement, is a policy that's designed to normalize a sense of fear about white replacement. I think if I can just add to this a little bit, a really important piece of context is how common a technique is the tightening of understandings about laws about citizenship. For strongmen, for nationalist movements, we see ideas about citizenship being deployed to exclude Muslim residents of India, many of whom sought refuge in India a long time ago, in Hungary, starting back in at least 2019, as Orban responded to asylum seekers who were a threat to white Christian identity. All of these national movements linked to citizenship and soil, blood identity, that has to be protected from outsiders. And this is always the background condition for the practical circumstances in which we find ourselves today. Huge buildup of immigration police, mass incarceration, changes to legal minutiae that make legitimate claims to asylum illegal, and of course, then the development of suspicions about U.S. citizens and residents who are targeted by white nationalists. Just the last thing I want to say, you asked, like, how can we think about this and deal with this? And one of the first things that comes to mind right now, and has for a while for me, is to insist that at least one party actually represent an expansive view of citizenship. So my students are always very surprised when I point out to them that Democrats, while not the source of the most inflammatory rhetoric on immigration, are kind of the problem in some ways, because they have leaned so heavily into enforcement. You saw it with, under Clinton, expedited removal, which is in the news now. That came about, right? It was action taken by Congress during the Clinton presidency. And most of the attempts at immigration reform proposed by Democrats in the last 20 years, if not longer, have sought to trade regularization of status for heavy enforcement and more money for immigration policing. That sets up this rhetoric about threat, I think. It primes us all to think that there's a threat that we have to compensate for. So I think the first step we can take is to reject that framing that we are being offered, that citizenship is scarce and that we have to wall ourselves inside a fortress.
I wish it were as simple as just explaining that to people and letting them know, but it's a perfect team of Julia, who recently wrote an incredible piece in Foreign Affairs about this dissonance between the framework under which our asylum system was created. And there's a lot of confusion, right? People don't know the difference between an asylum seeker, other type refugees, or just a migrant who doesn't fall under either category and enter the country by crossing the border without papers. So Julia's piece was about the dissonance between the framework under which our asylum system was created and the socioeconomic and political realities of today. And in her words, the reality is that officials in Washington will have to keep improvising at the border until the failings of asylum are reformed. And for that, Congress must act. Now, we saw what Congress did today. It did nothing. How can any kind of reform be accomplished in today's climate? I mean, can you just explain to us what is going on in Washington?
Well, I'm going to start by impressing on you the notion that the United States asylum system is failing. It is broken. We talk often about how broken our immigration system is, but this system, the asylum system, is not only broken, it is failing. It is failing in all of its central purposes. It is not providing timely protection in the United States to people who are legitimately expressing and experiencing persecution. It is not providing timely denials to people who may come to the border. They may have very great needs, but they are not going to fit the very limited and rigid description of persecution that exists in current American law. It is not providing an orderly way for people who are seeking asylum to cross the border. It's created real chaos at the border, and I appreciate the fact that this panel did not flinch from describing it as a crisis at the border, because there has been reluctance in some sectors to really use that word, and that is what is happening. We have a crisis at the border. And in addition to which, you have experienced here in New York the fact that the asylum system also is not providing timely work authorization to people who have been released into the United States, who are seeking asylum and who are going through a process. And so I just want to give you quickly some figures to illustrate what I'm talking about here. So as of October, we have 2.9 million cases in the backlog in the immigration courts. 2.9 million cases. We have a total of 700 immigration judges. Not all of those cases are asylum cases, but an increasing number of them are asylum cases. So that is approximately 4,000 cases per judge. Today, a person who's coming into immigration court with an asylum claim can reasonably expect to get their hearing on the final determination 4 years from now. That would be the date that they would get when they first get into court. When is your final hearing likely to be? Oh, 4 years from now. And what's the record here? So according to the immigration court system, the official yes, as of October, so in the last year, in this fiscal year, there were 23,700, 23,000, we're talking about 2.9 million cases. There were 23,700 grants in asylum cases. That's about a 15% win rate in asylum cases. There were more denials. These are percentages of the cases that were actually completed by immigration judges. There were 27,000 denials. That's to say, the number of people who are actually winning asylum in this court system is just, it's very small compared to the number of people who are going through the process. And I mean, Fernanda mentioned, but how many people, there were in fiscal 23, there were 2.4 million people encountered by the Border Patrol and by Customs and Border Protection along the border. These are stops, arrests, they call them encounters now, but so these are huge numbers. We haven't seen these numbers ever in American history. And since May of 2023, this year, the Biden administration, who has been accused repeatedly of having open borders, deported or removed 336,000 people from across the border. So there are these huge numbers of people coming across, huge numbers of people who are being deported or expelled back to their countries. And so what's going on here? Well, the asylum system was created as a kind of legal stepchild of the Refugee Act of 1980. And the vision of the Refugee Act is persecution of people, mainly the idea of what happened in World War II, the Holocaust, Jewish refugees coming from Europe, and at that time also you were beginning to see lots of people coming from Vietnam. But it's a political, religious persecution, persecution based on race, nationality, political opinion, what am I forgetting? There are 5 of them. Race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or as they put it, membership in a particular social group. That's the standard. So the asylum system was created, in the unlikely circumstance that someone would actually not be coming from Vietnam, or not be coming from Europe, but would actually show up at the southwest border and say, I need protection. This was a system that was created on a case-by-case determination. It was never contemplated to be what it is today, which is it has become a mass migration system for people coming to the southwest border. And so this system, as I said, it was never designed to do what it's being asked to do today. And part of the problem that the asylum system has created at the border, I'll just be very brief about this, is it has become a field day, a bonanza for smugglers. Why is that? Because the process of getting across the border, it's a very wide opening. So the law currently says that if you can put your foot on American soil, you have a right to make a statement, to express a fear that you are afraid to return to your home country, and that triggers a process. So the opening across the border is very wide, but as we've seen, the process for actually getting to a win, getting to a permanent grant, a secure grant of protection in the United States is very narrow. But the fact that the system has this very wide opening, smugglers have perceived that there's no risk for them. If they can just get somebody across the border, then the smuggler doesn't have to come himself. And so what used to be a high-risk occupation for smugglers has really become an almost zero-risk, very high-profit occupation for smugglers, in addition to which the narcotics cartels in Mexico have perceived very clearly that this profit could be for them. So there's been a kind of professionalization, a criminalization of the smuggling, the whole human smuggling process across the border. This is incredibly dangerous for the people who are coming. And it also allows the smugglers to really control the messaging in terms of what the possibilities are of getting into the United States. So this has just created this incredibly dangerous situation for people who have been coming to the border. So, so I'll just cut to the chase here. What happened? I will say that what happened today is a manifestation of the fact that, in my opinion, the advocacy community and the Democrats have pretty much lost the initiative on this issue by refusing or being very reluctant to recognize the scope of this crisis, how badly the system is failing. And so the Republicans have stepped into the breach, and what they are currently doing on Capitol Hill is there's a standoff going on over, as Fernanda mentioned, over the Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan funding bill, over something that's not related to any of those things, which is how to reform the asylum system. And the Republicans are basically asking for a series of reforms that would, in effect, shut down the system. They want to, among other things, put immigrant families in detention for the entire length of their asylum proceedings. They want to revise the standards so that you would basically, your interview of first instance would become an impossible standard to overcome. Now, the Democrats in the current negotiation are doing something that I think will happen, which is that there is a negotiation going on about raising that standard that for that kind of initial conversation that the asylum seekers have with authorities to get a little more, to get more of a higher standard in terms of that initial screening for whether or not you can meet the asylum standards. And in order not to monopolize this conversation, will just say that there is a way to fix this system and to maintain the United States commitments, very profound and valuable commitments that the United States has made to providing humanitarian protection to people who are really fleeing from life-threatening or extreme harms that could be described as persecution. The refugee system that we already have provides a kind of a map for that. But you can't fix the problem at the southern border unless you do something else, which is open up other legal channels to migration to come to the United States, and particularly legal channels for people who want to work to come to the United States and be able to work legally. And so there are solutions out there, and some of them can be done by Congress, and some of them can be done by the president without acts for Congress. But currently, what's going on in Congress right now is not really moving towards that solution.
I'm just sitting here impressed that you were able to pack so much into the time. And I'm sure that with each point that you raised and Elizabeth raised in my head, it was like, oh my gosh, I have so many questions. But one thing that you said, Julia, that I think is a good way to bring Van into the conversation is this idea of the refugee, the humanitarian aid type of system that is created in this country that is actually international law all over the country. You know, many other countries have been receiving refugees throughout, you know, since World War II, right? Since the system came into being because of the atrocities of World War II. But what's happening in many other places these days, many other countries, is also a movement by far right, by extremists that have stepped into this gap that also has been left by a lack of political action, a lack of solutions. So I wanted to ask you, Van, you know, there are record numbers of migrants now, mostly from Africa, landing in places like, or coming by boat, very dangerous journey, like the Canary Islands in Spain, Greece, Italy. In countries like Holland, migration now just became a top political issue and helped elect a far-right candidate. Can you help connect the dots? Because I think that many times people forget that what's happening here is also happening in other parts of the world. And it's all kind of part of this puzzle, right? This kind of messy puzzle out there.
Indeed, it's a global crisis that we're facing. What's happening in the U.S. is also unfolding across Europe from country to country. If I could just take a step back to frame this conversation, we're looking at basically a record number of people who are forcibly displaced from their homeland. In 2022, 108 million people were basically displaced individuals around the world. And that is basically twice as many as a decade ago in 2013, when it was only 50 million. So think about that, 100 million people on the move. And where do they go? But the US, Europe, Australia, and Canada, the global north, where opportunities are more abundant. What are they fleeing? We know the answer: war, conflict, violence, poverty, failing political institutions, and most urgently, climate change. So this is where we are with the global crisis, and this is really a record year. 2022 and 2023 promises to be even higher in terms of the numbers that we are calculating. So 2022 in some ways could be called the year of displacement, and that really has all types of ramifications for countries around the world. Just to come back to Europe for a second, Italy, Spain, and Greece are facing the most numbers coming in by sea because they are closest to the North African continent. Similar to the Darien Gap in Latin America, we have the Canary Islands. This is a group of islands off the shore of Spain, where it has been known as the most deadly crossing in that part of the Atlantic. Just to put it into context, about 30,000 people arrived last year to the Canary Islands of Spain, and 2,000 people lost their life on that journey, 10%, 8%. So people are desperate and they're fleeing desperation around the world. And when you think about what's happening in Europe as well as in the US, the crisis that we're facing has also created all types of very important consequences. The perceptions that migration is out of control, our border is out of control, as Julia described. The idea that immigration brings crime and is detrimental to the cultural values of our society, US society or European societies. And worse, the great replacement theory that immigrants, as Elizabeth had mentioned, are going to replace the native-born populations in all of these different countries. And that triggered fear. And that fear was exactly behind all of the movements of the rightward parties that we see in Germany, in Holland, in the Netherlands, in Hungary, obviously, and these are the global stages that this is playing out. Now, when you think about this kind of challenge that we're facing, the mismanagement of migration and asylum seekers that Julie described is not helping because it just fueled this perception that everything is out of control. And countries have tried, of course they have tried, they must try, to stem the tide of migrants coming through. And quite frankly, many of the methods that have been tried do not work. So one method is to basically send people back when they arrive on the shores of Greece. Greece is very, very strict. They pushed the migrants back and basically said the sending countries must take these illegal people back. It's not our problem. Other countries basically try a more diplomatic approach to border control along the lines of what we do here in the US as well, tightening the border, increasing surveillance of the border, and cracking down on smuggling networks that helped enable the migration to continue and to grow. Another approach is what our own mayor did in Latin America, Eric Adams, telling the migrants not to come because there's no jobs here in New York City. it doesn't work because we are not addressing the root causes of global migration, and that really has to do with war, poverty, and conflict. And this is where the line between refugees and voluntary migrants blurred, because traditionally we talk about refugees and asylees fleeing persecution, whereas voluntary migrants, like economic migrants, are coming here for economic opportunities and poverty. But what we're seeing is the blurring of these categories, and that really is another piece of this broken system that Julia has pointed to, that we have to fix all of these parts together. So where do we find hope? I would say that if you look across the country and across Europe, Germany provides some hope. If you remember, 8 years ago in 2015, Germany accepted 1.3 million refugees from Syria, the largest numbers during that moment of crisis, because Germany needed labor, and they imported labor. The good news there are quite profound in the most preliminary research that we see. 3 years into the 2015 resettlement, and there are lessons drawn for what we are doing right now. Basically, about 90% of them are either granted asylum, not waiting for asylum granting, as well as
90, right?
90% have been granted asylum and or authorized to work. Just to be more precise, 71% granted asylum and 17% were authorized to work. So 90% of them were working by 2018. Germany has a very low bar toward the entry for the labor market because after 3 months in the country, they could work. Other countries made you wait a year, 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, and so on. Germany also was very, very clear about integration. So they did 2 things. One, language training. They actually provided 600 hours of language learning. And over the course of 3 years, remarkably, when the migrants arrived, only 1% of them spoke any German. By 2018, 44% of them spoke good or very good German. Think about that. What does that do for integration, for economic opportunities? And finally, over half of them were working and earning income by 2018. So that really is where I want to kind of draw our attention to, because I think that with the forcibly displaced people, there are 3 approaches to solving the problem. 1, send them back. 2, help integrate them into the local community where they are settling. For example, Syrians in Turkey, in Jordan, and Lebanon. And 3, send them to a 3rd country, which is the U.S. and or some European countries. The migrants in New York City is a case in point. They're here, they're part of us. So we either choose to try to antagonize them and try to single them out and discriminate against them, or we choose the other path, which is to allow them to work and help them integrate into American society, because that is the only solution that is humane and also rational, given the current system that is completely broken. I have more to say, but let me pause there.
Well, thank you so much. And, I myself am an immigrant. I came to this country in 1998 to go to graduate school, and many things happened in my life, and here I am 25 years later. And I like to say that I'm 100% an immigrant, 100% an American, and I think those 2 things are not mutually exclusive. I think there may be some of you here who feel the same way. Maybe Cinthya does. I wanted to bring you into the conversation, Cinthya, to talk about this idea of the immigrant identity and the American identity. What are they, and how do these impact or frame this idea that we have of country, of home, and belonging here in the United States? And I know you have some pictures that you want to show as you talk, so it's good to have something a little more uplifting.
Thank you so much and for having us and for create this panel discussion. I will speak in a more joyful way because everything that we haven't listened is really tough, and the condition in our countries make us immigrate and to find better ways to live. So that's the reason when you were speaking about ideas to how to resolve this problem from the States, is like to create a better opportunities, but also better conditions in our countries. At least in Mexico, we have been like facing a war, a drug war since long time ago. So it's one of the reasons because we come to this country. So I think that the identity is really difficult to speak about one identity for immigrants and from people from the United States that born here, because also here is like a melting pot, not just because the migration, the different ways of migration, is also you have the Native American that has different kind of idea of identity and how they express them, their culture, their languages, but also African American and Asian Americans. And so I will speak more focused, and you are going to see some photographs that I have been taking through my work as a documentary photographer and artist, that maybe can show you or can reflect what I am speaking. For Mexican, for example, we have these different kind of ways that start on the Programa Bracero, and a lot of them are indigenous. And until now, recently, through the work that lawyers are doing in the courts, they recognize that a lot of the migration, the Mexican migration and South American migration, is indigenous. They don't speak Spanish. So identity comes a lot of the times through language, but also through food, to the way of we think, or philosophy. So the ethnicity of migrant is really diverse, is really the symbol, no? And just thinking about in this city that we speak more than 700 languages. So that tells you something, that we cannot put everybody in the same box. But speaking about, for example, Mexican, we express our identity through maybe Cinco de Mayo, or maybe to the Day of the Dead, that now more people are related to. In this photo that you are looking, this is an archival material that I collect when I was doing my research about the Sanctuary movement in the 80s, and it's indigenous women that crossed the border during that time. That was also all the discourse of the crisis in this country, and also you have a flyer of what was going on with women's movement during that time. So in here is a family from Indonesia that took refuge in a church in Meriden in Connecticut. They're now outside. And also speaking about how all of this identity is in a graphic level expressed in this country, is like, I think, the way that we organize ourselves. Sometimes it could be through Tequio. I like to say that Tequio is some kind of organization that we have that not a lot of people notice. Is like mutual aid. And it's the way that you look the migrants or the culture of migrants. But also the way in which in this country now we say we eat more tacos in the transnational space than in Mexico. So I think like food, it could be another part of this this shape. And also I think like, let me pass. I have been like really investigating or doing research about language, because I am really interested in like how first generation are thinking of the idea of belonging. First generation that are from Mexico, from Guatemala, but they born in a family that is indigenous. It could be Quiche, Cachiquel, Sutujil, Mixteco, and how they identify themselves as a Mixteco American or as a Mixteco American from the Bronx. And having working through different workshops with children that they listen in their homes, no Spanish, they listen an indigenous language. And in this workshop, I took some codex from the regions that they are coming from, and they start to put in some of the part of the codex in the photographs that we took in collaboration. So also expression like Carnival. I know that in many countries like Brazil we have the Carnival, but you see it all the time, not just in New York City, you see in Los Angeles, you see in Tucson or in the border. So I feel like looking this image is like, for example, this woman, I met her in Sunset Park, and she was dressing up the traditional traje from Guatemala. She's quiche with her belt that is called faja. So just looking to her is like, this is part of her identity, and also they are part or interway into this system. I feel that sometimes the idea of assimilation, it could be problematic because at least in Mexico, come from this idea of you have to erase your culture or part of your culture and start like integrate into this new idea of America that
Which is very specifically and narrowly framed too, right?
yeah, and this Anglo idea, you have to why yourself or forget where you are coming from. And for example, I have the opportunity to work with people who was on detention in New Jersey, and I create a series of collages taking their stories of what they were suffering in this detention center that during that time, during the Trump administration, everybody was speaking about the border detention center, but no New Jersey jails and detention center that are they keep the immigrants for last in this country, are one of the worst. So one of the detainees grow her own story in quiche of what was happening. So I bring the language when I speak an idea, and also about food. I bring some photos of food. And also, another thing that I have been thinking about is herbs, and how when we come to this country, we came with a lot of objects, how objects can tell us about our culture or identity. And nowadays, after COVID, the people is speaking more about healing and the which and we can confront trauma. And I used to live in Sunset Park, so I used to go to the grocery store and look the parts in the grocery that is dedicated for the herbs. And I have been creating a project where I do research asking women most of the time to write about their memories around their knowledge, their ancestral knowledge about the heirs that have been immigrated with them. So through that kind of work, I try to look more into our identity.
I love how hearing you talk, I think that the people have resolved the question of the differences, right? Like we have somehow, even without realizing, figured out a way to live together, to coexist. 700 languages in New York City. It's incredible. I lived in Jackson Heights, Queens, before I moved to Hamilton Heights, which is mostly Dominican. But I remember hearing so many different languages and accents on the streets, right? It's fascinating. So I wanted to, because we have, my watch is always like 20 minutes ahead, so I'm making sure. We have about 14 minutes. So I wanted to ask each of you about, this idea of citizenship and this idea of who we are. What is it that the current situation tell us about, and it may be such a long, please try to not go on forever because it's a broad question, but I am thinking about what it is that the moment we're in, both politically and demographically, tell us about who we are. I'm hearing you talk about, I just heard you talk about Cinthya, and there's a good feeling about it, right? There's something positive that comes out of it. But I'm curious, I wanted to, I don't know if any of you wants to start, but I'm thinking maybe we can go back to you, Elizabeth, since you opened things up, talking about, what is it that you think the moment we're in tell us about us as a country?
So I love the way sorry, I forget myself. I love the way you framed that because I can't remember the exact year, but I think it might have been 2003. The infamous Samuel Huntington published the book, Who Are We? And I don't think I am saying anything particularly like that people would really strongly disagree with when I say that it was a pretty openly racist portrayal of who the United States has been, in which he engages ideas of an American creed that he links to a distinctly Anglo-Protestant history. And so Sam Huntington came to the school I was teaching at the time, which was Syracuse University, and we had a debate. And so I discussed with him the very obvious facts that we're not just an Anglo-Protestant. We have not ever been just influenced or founded by people who exclusively represented an Anglo-Protestant tradition. But I ended by just saying that I think the thing we should really be focused on is, who do we want to be? Because that's what we have. We have our future. And, I think if you look around at how we're behaving right now, we're behaving like a profoundly insecure set of people who wants to define itself against outsiders. And I don't think if you presented that to anybody that they'd say, yes, that's who we want to be. So I think contained in some of the alarming information presented by Julia in particular, I think we can look to very specific procedures that we've put into place or removed and say, like, is this, what a confident, secure country does? And if not, what would it do? So I'll stop there.
I think if I can bring you in, Julia, because it seems to me that, what's going on in Congress sometimes feels so disconnected then to and maybe just because my friends are so embracing of immigrants and liberals, it may just be that. But it just seems so disconnected or so out of touch with the possibilities and the everyday realities that we live, even in the city, but even in smaller places. I've been to, as a reporter, I lived and covered Arizona for 10 years. And there's a whole stereotypical idea, but on the ground, it plays out very differently. So how do you see that when you look at the political dynamic and sort of like what's ahead, right? I mean, should we be worried it's an election year next year? We're hearing, there's a debate going on pretty soon. But
I really, yes, I think we should be worried because the failure to solving some of these immigration problems, this is a practical policy problem. There are practical ways that this for the asylum system, it can be fixed. And the fact that we haven't moved in that direction, the fact that we haven't moved in the direction of finally providing legal status, work authorization, basic rights to undocumented people who've been in this country for 20 years, who have American citizen children and now grandchildren who are American citizens. The fact that we have allowed these problems to just continue to fester in our community and to diminish people that are in the community means now that the problems themselves are causing this kind of intensifying polarization that we have in the country. And so, I think that it is indisputable that immigration has been an amazing motor of dynamism and diversity and innovation and energy in this country. I mean, you just, go to Jackson Heights, go anywhere where there's an immigrant community and there's small businesses and people who just want to work and who see this country as the opening for opportunity. that they didn't have in the place that they came from. You know, if you believe that, then you need to get with your congressperson and get with your senator and say, we do care about immigration. We want you to solve this problem. We want you to stop like putting it off. And I'm talking about the Biden administration and the Democrats as much as the Republicans. The Democrats, particularly under the Biden administration, the border has been so difficult to manage that I think President Biden just has wanted it to go away. And it's not going away.
Go away.
It's not going away. You know, so let's engage our political system in defense of these basic values about immigration and not let the people in Congress just do what they're doing today, which is you have this very important national security bill that involves especially the aid for Ukraine, and they're holding the whole process up to try and force through a negotiation or a non-negotiation over issues which have actual solutions. They can be solved, but you can't solve it by forcing it into another package. You need to have a negotiation. You know, maybe we're not going to do some enormous piece of legislation that's going to solve all the problems at once, but there are problems you could solve. You could provide legislation for the agricultural workforce. You could provide a path to citizenship for young immigrants who came when they were 3 years old. I mean, these are not hard problems to solve. We can do it, but I appeal to you, if you care about this issue, if you believe in the legacy of the United States as a country, you know, I mean, forget the welcoming. It's just that, you know, the dynamism of this country is based so much on the succeeding generations of people who've come to renew the idea and who come with a sense of patriotism and a sense of admiration for this country, that in many cases Americans have lapsed, you know, with the American population. So if you believe that, get with your congressman, get with your senator, tell them we need to solve these problems. This is an important issue. Please don't set it aside or let it languish for another 20 years. Thank you.
Get with your congressman, get with your senators. You said something, Van, that is been in my head, which is this idea that there is this very interesting solution or very interesting model that Germany implemented, right? And what I keep thinking about, it connects to something Julia said, because I like to say that this country, the United States, has created, it's almost, it's such a great marketing campaign to the world, right, that everybody wants to come here. Everybody wants to come here because this country sold itself as the place where your dreams come true. You come and you work and you become somebody. You can build a future, right? But I wonder how much, I wonder if you could, I would like for you to speak about how much of that may interfere in our ability, in the United States ability, or Congress, United States Congress's ability and president's ability to look at other places in the world and say, you know, we're not doing it right, but this place is, we're gonna follow their lead and we're gonna implement something similar here. How much of that, of our ego, gets in the way?
I don't think it's a matter of ego. I think that we actually have yet to come to grasp with the reality that this is an intractable problem globally. We are still thinking we can solve it somehow, and it's going to just get worse in the next decade or so. Because I'll give you two numbers, and then we'll come back to where you're asking. Of the 100 million people I just told you earlier, a third of them, 35 million, are refugees. Last year, we resettled 114,000 people, less than 1% of all refugees worldwide. It would take us 100 years to resettle all of them, which is not going to be a solution. So we have to be realistic. Julia mentioned that we have like 2.4 million asylum applications right now in the US, and every year we adjudicate 24, 40, 50 cases, 50,000 cases, and that basically means you have to adjudicate another 25 years to just get up to the point where we are now. So we just have to recognize that the framework we often use to think about migration, the us versus them divide, is no longer accurate in this situation. And I actually don't think it's even a Democrat or Republican thing, because when the border is flooding with all of these migrants coming from Latin America, I don't know who's in the White House, but the problem is the same. It's a major crisis. So let me now come back to where you are saying that Germany might be a model. One other data point I didn't mention earlier to you, which I found very interesting actually, was that 55% of Germans were involved in integrating the refugees arriving by giving money, by hosting a family, by helping out in the local community. And that, I think, is the key to breaking down this us versus them mentality. That is the lesson we draw, which is that when you think about migration and immigrants as your friends, your classmates, your professors, your teachers, your colleagues, you're warm and fuzzy toward them. But when you think about them in the abstract, we have this perception that they are alien, they are foreign. I myself am a refugee. I'm alien because I do speak English, for example, with an accent, right? So I think when we think about that, and when you look at the empirical data, one more data point that is actually very interesting for you, that's very interesting to me, which is when you look at counties across the country, the counties with the lowest shares of immigrants are also those with the highest level of anti-immigrant sentiment. Think about that. You don't have them in your county, so why are you anti-immigrant? It's the opposite of the friendliness, the kind of connection that we build across the native-born population and the immigrant population that will allow us to forge a future.
Cinthya, I want to close with you, and I'm going to tell you, we want to open up for questions, and we want to hopefully hear from you. But you've met so many fascinating people from countries, people who come here looking for this better life. What is it that they have taught you about what it means to be an American?
I think it's deeply complicated questions because usually, and I was thinking in what you were saying about if migration is a problem. I feel that migration is not a problem. The problem is the intervention policies that this country has had through the own history in our countries. That's the reason because we are here. And speaking with some migrants, they sometimes don't feel an American. They feel indigenous person from El Salvador. They are maybe Pipil, or they feel they are indigenous person from Guatemala. And also, I think that we need to start changing our terms or vocabulary or concept about how to refer to others, like aliens, like illegal, or an American, because also American is a continent. So, yeah, I think so.
I love the idea of American as a continent because I'm South American. So I said I've always been an American.
Yeah, I feel American. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. I would like to open up for questions. There are microphones on both sides. If you don't mind walking to the microphone. And the reason is that the people at home in Zoom, they hear the questions this way. And also, some of you may not be as loud as I am. I probably didn't even need a microphone, but, just to follow protocol. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hal. I'm American born, and I too speak with an accent. I say we all speak English, but we speak a different brand of English to each other. But the beauty is knowing other people from other countries and learning about their countries. But I see the issue of immigration not as a migration from violence, but more economic. And the issue we have here is that the birth rate in this country is down. And when birth rates are down in countries, the countries start to die. We say we have jobs. We need people for the jobs. We don't have people for the jobs. To what extent do you think the anger from people is the fact that people are coming here and they're placed in a situation where they can't earn a living, they can't contribute to economically? We have a situation in here where in New York, where we're told we have to cut the budget 5% this year, 5% at the beginning of next year, and kids in school are going to get cuts in their physical education on other things, programs that are important. Music and physical education are very important, but they're the first things we cut. So what do you see in terms of the economic situation in English?
Who wants to take that on?
I'll take that one. I mean, I think this is a classic, this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the antagonism that has been created in New York City is because of the dysfunction of the asylum system. You know, we have, you know, more than 100,000 people who've come. Now they're trapped in this system. They're not going to get an answer to their question for another, if they actually succeed in getting into the asylum system, finding an attorney, it could be 3 or 4 years before they'll get an answer. Meanwhile, the asylum system prevents people from getting work authorization for at least 6 months. In practice, it will, for most of these folks, it will be significantly longer than that. And so you have this crazy situation where people are trapped in a system where they don't, you know, for many of these folks, winning asylum is not the goal. What they really want is to win a secure place in the United States and be able to go to work and support their families. And precisely that is what the system is not allowing them to do right now, which is what is creating antagonism. The mayor of New York obviously isn't helping with his rhetoric and the way he's kind of pitted. He's ended up, you know, that's an ironic, it's a bittersweet situation where New York City has given, I mean, shelter, an amazingly generous reception in a certain way to these folks, much more generous than previous generations of asylum seekers have received in the United States. But the way the system functions, it's put such a burden on the city of New York that now the mayor has kind of turned against his own programs. And so this is what I'm talking about. We need to fix these problems, or they're just going to make these antagonisms worse. And the way to fix it is to allow people who really just want to come to the United States and they want to work and they want to fill the jobs that are out there that will allow them to work. Let's figure out a way for them to do that in an effective way.
We have another question here. Thank you so much for your question.
Yes, I can't disagree with anything that I've heard here, and you know, it's really such a complex problem. But one thing I can say as a person that travels and been in politics for years, the American public is hardening against immigration. I spend time going into rural Pennsylvania and upstate New York, and the people have never been so much anti-immigrant. And it's in America, there is just not the appetite to deal with the situation, even though it has to be dealt with. And being in politics, I know that image means much more than substance. And people are not well informed. You know, they are getting their news from Fox and organs such as that. And there is just a hardening of attitudes. And I sense it's more hard today than it was 2 or 3 years ago in general. I think the American public has to somehow be educated, but I don't know how. And, you know, the politicians are using this to their best, you know, advantage to, you know, get, you know, right-wing forces to, you know, take over completely. And I just don't see any way that the, you know, the American public is going to change. If you have any ways of doing this, let me know. But
I was
can't
just going to
argue.
ask the panel, because I hear what you're saying, and sometimes I feel that way, but I am a glass half full kind of person. I also refuse to give up, right? And we can't give up. This is an incredible country. And so I don't know if any of you want to talk about this idea of what is it that I mean, Van talked about the interaction, right? The familiarity, that when you meet people and you know others, that you get to understand who they are as humans as opposed to migrants. But I don't know if you or Elizabeth have anything, or Cinthya, anything that you want to, anything in specific that you think can be helpful. I want to say that we need a more robust ecosystem of news that's grounded on people, local people who understand the local dynamics and speak that language. But that's because I'm a journalist. But I don't know. Any thoughts on that, Elizabeth?
I want to say something. So first of all, I love being back in the city because the questions are just the kind of questions that I really want answers to, and just hearing them energizes me. But I spent a long time in a place you mentioned, which is upstate New York. And upstate New York is also where my own family was resettled in a previous generation of humanitarian resettlement. And you're right, it's deeply red and getting, more deeply red with every passing election cycle. It's also a place where we've seen some models of very effective programs, right? So Schenectady, Utica, Syracuse, these are cities that have received large numbers of refugees and managed to very successfully, in both directions, integrate refugees and native-born U.S. citizens together. And it's been extremely beneficial for everybody, really. It's a true model of mutual benefit. And I think there's a connection here between a contact hypothesis that we could support. It hasn't changed the direction of politics yet. Right-wing movements end. They don't end well, but they end. And after that, we're going to, however this ends, we're going to have to look to those models of very local programs that were extremely successful at doing what we're talking about doing here.
Thank you so much. I actually wrote a story from Utica about a soccer team where nobody spoke the language of the other players, and they all played.
Can I just add a footnote to this, if you don't mind?
It has to be I just want to see if we can fit in one more question. Sorry, go ahead. No, Van, you can add. Okay. I want to make sure that we hear the questions, so go ahead, sir.
Have you gone back to New American history and looked at it? Because this is not the first time this has happened. You can go all the way back to Benjamin Franklin, who was writing nasty articles about too many Germans coming into the country at one time. And you have the Know-Nothings, and you have the Asian Exclusion Act, and you had the quota system, and even Franklin Delano Roosevelt made a huge mistake. He turned a boat full of Jewish refugees back who were fleeing Hitler, and most of those people perished in the Holocaust. So have you looked at American history to see how this turns out?
I'm sure we've all looked at it. I didn't mean to cut you off, Van, if you want to jump in.
I can start here. Obviously, we have been here before, and we succeeded in integrating immigrants 100 years ago, 50 years ago. So I don't think that this is going to be the next big challenge. What is different, though, I think, is the sheer scale and intensity of migration that we're seeing right now. This is unprecedented. And I think that really made it much more challenging for us to integrate. There's no hiatus for us to sort of take a breather in between. And if this continues, it's just basically it's going to exacerbate another problem, which is the economic cost of migration. The reason why there's so much antagonism right now is because we are facing a lot of declining economic opportunities in a lot of these upstate places that you're describing. Why we're spending billions of dollars, let me repeat, billions of dollars, which is more than the CUNY budget, why we're being told that CUNY is supposed to cut 5%. How could that not cause anxiety and antagonism? Because I don't want my students to have fewer fundings, but this is a us versus them framing that we are facing, and that has everything to do with the mismanagement of this crisis.
I just wanted to say, to have maybe a slightly more hopeful note here. So one of the things that the Biden administration did along the lines of what Van was talking about was in the situation of the people from Ukraine, which is they created a new program that allows individuals, rather than NGOs, rather than some kind of formal resettlement agency, which was the old way, or still is the way that refugees were resettled. In the case of Ukraine, they allowed an individual or a family or individuals in the society to come forward and be sponsors. And that has been an incredibly successful program, because these are people who are coming forward and saying, yes, I want them, I'll come, I'll help them. And so, that seems to me to be a model that we could do much more with out in the country.
Kinda like the German
However, I will point out that the authority that the Biden administration used to bring in those people from Ukraine is precisely the authority, it's called a parole, don't get me to explain it, that the Republicans are trying to cancel in the legislation that they voted down today. So that authority that created this very positive program that allowed this person-to-person sponsorship is precisely the authority that the Republican Party is attempting to kill. And this is just to explain this standoff that's going on in Washington and why the bill went down today. I think the Democrats correctly are saying, no, wait a minute, if we don't want to do that, so.
Ben is like picking up the microphone. I say, I have a duty to end this at 7:45 p.m. and I think we are, right? I have 1 minute? Okay, so I'm gonna give, if you can articulate your question succinctly, and we'll get somebody to answer it succinctly, we can get out of here at.
No, just I give the closing word to someone else. I will not be able to do that.
So Van, you can have the last word if you want.
I was just going to add a footnote that the program that Julie described for Ukrainians has also been extended to Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. So this is where the promise is, and this is where the hope is.
So we're doing the Germany thing. We are kind of doing that, right? Canada, Elizabeth was just saying, has been doing that, has been very successful in doing that. So I love that we ended on a hopeful note. We're actually doing things right. It's just that Congress just doesn't talk about it. Its messaging also seems to be a big problem. But we will start a whole other discussion. I want to thank all of you for being such a great audience, the panelists for being incredible. I took so many notes myself, like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Thank you, everybody at home who's watching.